Section 71 of Wagner the Wehr-Wolf by George W. M. Reynolds. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 64. While the incidents related in the last few chapters were taking place at the Riverola Palace, the Council of State had assembled to receive the Grand Vizier, the mighty Ibrahim, who had signified his intention of meeting that august body at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Accordingly, as soon as he had witnessed the marriage ceremony which united his sister to the Count of Riverola, he returned from Wagner's mansion to his own pavilion in the midst of the Ottoman encampment. There he arrayed him in a manner becoming his exalted rank, and mounting his splendid caparisoned steed, he repaired with a brilliant escort to the ducal palace. The streets of the city of Florence were thronged with multitudes eager to gain a sight of the representative of the sultan, a view of the man whose will and pleasure swayed the greatest empire in existence at that period of the world's age. And as Ibrahim passed through those avenues so well known to him, threaded through thoroughfares, each feature of which was so indelibly impressed upon his memory, and beheld many familiar spots, all of which awakened in his mind reminiscences of a happy childhood, and of years gone by, when, too, he reflected that he had quitted Florence poor, obscure, and unmarked amidst the millions of his fellow men, and that now, as he entered the beauteous city, multitudes came forth to gaze upon him, as on one invested with a high rank and enjoying a power mighty to do much. When he thought of all this, his bosom swelled with mingled emotions of pride and tenderness, regret and joy, and while tears trembled upon his long black lashes, a smile of haughty triumph played on his lips. On the procession goes, through the crowded streets and across the spacious squares, watched by the eyes of transcendent beauty and proud aristocracy from the balconies of palaces and the casements of lordly mansions. On, amidst a wondering and admiring populace, and grateful, too, that so great a chief as Ibrahim should have spared their city from sack and ruin. At length the Grand Vizier, attended by the great beglerbegs and pashas of his army, entered the square of the ducal palace, and as his prancing steed bore him proudly beneath the massive arch, the roar of artillery announced to the City of Flowers that the Ottoman minister was now within the precincts of the dwelling of the Florentine sovereign. The duke and the members of the Council of State were all assembled in the court of the palazzo to receive the illustrious visitor, who, having dismounted from his horse, accompanied the prince and those high dignitaries to the council chamber. When the personages thus assembled had taken their seats around the spacious table, covered with a rich red velvet cloth, the Grand Vizier proceeded to address the duke and the councilors. "High and mighty prince, and noble and puissant lords," he said, in the tone of one conscious of his power, "I am well satisfied with the manner in which my demands have been fulfilled up to this moment. Two ladies, in whom I feel a deep and sincere interest, and who were most unjustly prisoned to suit the vindictive purposes of the Count of Arestino, have been delivered up to me, and ye have likewise agreed to make full and adequate atonement for the part which Florence enacted in the late contest between the Christians and Mussulmans in the island of Rhodes. I have therefore determined to reduce my demands upon the republic, for indemnity and compensation, to as low a figure as my own dignity and a sense of that duty which I owe to my sovereign, whom God preserve many days, will permit. The sum that I now require from your treasury, mighty prince and puissant lords, is 100,000 pistoles; and in addition thereto, I claim peculiar privileges for Ottoman vessels trading to Leghorn, guarantee of peace on the part of the republic for 3 years, and release of such prisoners now in the dungeons of the Inquisition, whom it may seem good to me thus to mark out as deserving of your mercy." "100,000 pistoles, my lord, would completely exhaust the treasury of the republic," said the duke, with dismay pictured upon his countenance. "Think you," cried the Grand Vizier, angrily, "that I shall dare to face my imperial master on my return to Constantinople, unless I be able to lay at his feet a sum adequate to meet the expenses incurred by this expedition of a great fleet and a powerful army?" "Your highness will at least accord us a few days wherein to obtain the amount required," said the duke, "for it will be necessary to levy a tax upon the republic." "I grant you until sunset, my lord until sunset this evening," added the Grand Vizier, speaking with stern emphasis; "and if you will permit me to tender my advice, you will at once command the Grand Inquisitor and the Count of Arestino to furnish the sum required, for the former I am inclined to suspect is a most unjust judge, and the latter, I am well convinced, is a most cruel and revengeful noble." "The Count of Arestino is no more, your highness," answered the Duke.
The Marquis of Orsini murdered him before the very eyes of the Grand Inquisitor, and will therefore head the procession of victims at the approaching auto da fe." "By the footstool of Allah, that shalt not be!"
exclaimed Ibrahim.
"The machinations of the Count of Arestino threw into the inquisition dungeons those two ladies whom he delivered up to me last night; and it was my intention, when I spoke of releasing certain prisoners ere now, to stipulate for the freedom of all those whom the vengeance of that count has immured in your accursed prison house. See then, my lords, that all those of whom I speak be forthwith brought hither into our presence."
It may be proper to inform the reader that Flora had solicited her brother to save the Marquis of Orsini and the Countess Giulia, to whom the young wife of Francisco had been indebted for her escape from the Carmelite convent; for, as the secrets of the torture chamber were never suffered to transpire, she was of course ignorant of the death of the guilty Giulia, and of the assassination of the Count of Arestino by the Marquis of Orsini. At the command of Ibrahim Pasha, who spoke in a firm and resolute manner, the duke summoned a sentinel from the corridor adjoining the council chamber, and issued the necessary orders to fulfill the desire of the grand vizier. Nearly a quarter of an hour elapsed, during which one of the councilors drew up the guarantee of peace and of the commercial privileges demanded by Ibrahim. At length the door opened, and several familiars made their appearance, leading in Manuel d'Orsini and Isaachar ben Solomon, both heavily chained. The former walked with head erect and proud bearing; the latter could scarcely drag his wasted, racked, and tottering limbs along, and was compelled to hang upon the arms of the familiars for support. Nevertheless, there was something so meek, so patient, and so resigned in the expression of the old and persecuted Israelite's countenance, that Ibrahim Pasha's soul was touched with a sentiment of pity in his behalf.
"But these are not all the prisoners!"
exclaimed the grand vizier, turning angrily toward the duke.
"Where is the Countess Giulia of Arestino?" "My lord, she is no more,"
answered the prince.
"And Heaven be thanked that she is indeed no more!"
cried Manuel d'Orsini, in a tone of mingled rage and bitterness.
"Fortunate is it for her that death has snatched her away from the grasp of miscreants in human shape and who call themselves Christians. My lord," he continued, turning toward Ibrahim, "I know not who you are, but I perceive by your garb that you are a Moslem, and I presume that your rank is high by the title addressed to you by the duke." "Presume not thus to intrude your observations on his highness the grand vizier,"
exclaimed one of the councilors in a severe tone.
"On the contrary,"
said Ibrahim Pasha,
"let him speak, and without reserve. My lord of Orsini, fear not, I will protect you." "The remark I was about to make, illustrious vizier," cried Manuel, "is brief, though it may prove not palatable to the patrons of the Inquisition and the supporters of that awful engine of despotism and cruelty," he added, glancing fiercely at the duke and the assembled councilors. "I was anxious to observe that the Christian Church has founded and maintained that abhorrent institution, and that there is more true mercy, more genuine sympathy, and more of the holy spirit of forgiveness in the breast of this reviled, despised, and persecuted Jew, than in the bosoms of all the miserable hypocrites who have dared to sanction the infernal tortures which have been inflicted upon him. For myself, I would not accept mercy at their hands, and I would rather go in the companionship of this Jew to the funeral pile, than remain alive to dwell amongst a race of incarnate fiends, calling themselves Christians." "This insolence is not to be borne,"
exclaimed the duke, starting from his seat, his countenance glowing with indignation.
"Your highness and all the councilors now assembled well merit the reproaches of the Marquis of Orsini,"
said the grand vizier, sternly.
"But it is for me to command here, and for you to obey. Proud prince, let the chains be removed from those prisoners forthwith."
The duke sank back in his chair, and subduing his rage as well as he was able, he made a sign to the familiars to set the Jew and the marquis at liberty.
"Grand vizier,"
exclaimed Manuel,
"the life and the liberty which, at your all powerful nod, are restored to me will prove irksome and valueless if I be compelled to remain in a Christian land. Confer not favors by halves, my lord. Render me completely grateful to you. Take me into your service, even as a slave, if your highness will. But let me accompany to a Mussulman country a Mussulman who can teach the Christians such a fine lesson of mercy and forgiveness." "You shall go with me to Constantinople, Manuel, but not as a slave,"
returned Ibrahim, profoundly touched by the sincere tone and earnest manner of the young noble.
"No, you shall accompany me as a friend."
"A thousand thanks, grand vizier, for this kindness, this generosity," said the marquis, deeply affected; then as a sudden idea struck him, he turned toward the Jew, exclaiming,
But we must not leave this old man behind us. 'Twere the same as if we were to abandon a helpless child in the midst of a forest inhabited by ferocious wolves."
"Yes, yes, let me accompany you, excellent young man," murmured Isaachar, clinging to the arm of the marquis, for their chains were now knocked off. "You were the first Christian who ever spoke kindly to me, and I have no kith, no kindred on the face of the earth. I am a lone, desolate old man, but I have wealth, much wealth, Manuel d'Orsini, and all that I have shall be thine."
"The Jew shall accompany us also, my lord,"
said Ibrahim, addressing himself to the marquis. Then, turning toward the duke, he exclaimed in a severe tone,
"But a few hours remain till sunset, and the ransom of 100,000 pistoles must be paid to me, or I will deliver up this proud palace and the homes of the councilors now assembled to the pillage of my troops."
"Nay, nay, my lord," cried the Jew, horror struck at the threat. "Bring not the terrors of sack and storm and carnage into this fair city. 100,000 pistoles, your highness says. 100,000 pistoles," he added, in a slower and more musing tone. "'Tis a large sum, a very large sum; and yet, to save so many men and their innocent families from ruin, from desolation yes, my lord," he exclaimed, hastily interrupting himself, I will pay you the ransom money."
"No, by Allah!"
ejaculated Ibrahim.
"Not a single pistole shall be thus extorted from thee. Sooner shall the Florentine treasury grant thee an indemnification for the horrible tortures which thou hast endured, than thy wealth be poured forth to furnish this ransom money. Come, my lord of Orsini, come, worthy Jew," continued the grand vizier, rising from his seat. "We will depart to the Ottoman encampment."
"Patience, your highness, for a few hours," urged the duke.
"And the 100,000 pistoles shall be counted out before this poor man,"
answered the grand vizier, indicating the Jew with a rapid glance,
"has been so racked and tortured in your accursed prison house, that he cannot be too speedily placed under the care of mine own chirurgeon. For this reason I depart at once. See that the ransom be dispatched to my pavilion ere the sun shall have set behind the western hills."
With these words the grand vizier bowed haughtily to the duke, and quitted the council chamber. Manuel d'Orsini followed, supporting Isaachar ben Solomon, and, on reaching the court, one of Ibrahim's slaves took the Jew up behind him on his steed. The marquis was provided with a horse, and the cavalcade moved rapidly away from the precincts of the ducal palace. Profiting by the hint which Ibrahim Pasha had offered them, the duke and the councilors instantly levied a heavy fine upon the grand inquisitor, and the remainder of the money required to make up the amount demanded was furnished from the public treasury. Thus by the hour of sunset the ransom was paid. At an early hour on the ensuing morning, Francisco di Riverola and his beautiful blushing bride quitted the chamber where they had passed the night in each other's arms, and repaired to the apartment where so many terrible mysteries had been revealed to them, and so many dreadful incidents had occurred on the preceding day. Hand in hand they had traversed the passages and the corridors leading to that room in which they had left Christian Rosencrux with the dead Wagner and the dying Nisida. Hand in hand and silently they went, that fine young noble and charming bride. On reaching the door of the chamber, Francisco knocked gently, and the glance of intelligence which passed between himself and Flora showed that each was a prey to the same breathless suspense, the same mingled feelings of bright hopes and vague fears. In a few moments the door was slowly opened, and the venerable old man appeared, his countenance wearing a solemn and mournful aspect. Then Francisco and the young countess knew that all was over, and tears started into their eyes. Christian Rosencrux beckoned them to advance toward the bed, around which the curtains were drawn closer; and as they entered the room, the rapid and simultaneous glances which they cast toward the spot where Fernand Wagner fell down and surrendered up his breath, showed them that the corpse had been removed. Approaching the bed with slow and measured steps, Rosencrux drew aside the drapery, and for a moment Francisco and Flora shrank back from the spectacle which met their view; but at the next instant they advanced to the couch, and contemplated with mournful attention the scene presented to them. For there, upon the couch, side by side, lay Fernand Wagner and Nisida Riverola, stiff, motionless, cold.
"Grieve not for her loss, children,"
said Christian Rosencrux.
"she has gone to a happier realm; for the sincere repentance which she manifested in her last hours has atoned for all the evil she wrought in her lifetime. From the moment, young lady, when she banished from her soul the rancor long harbored against thee, from the instant that she received thee in her arms and called thee sister. The blessing of heaven was vouchsafed upon her; she was penitent, very penitent, while I administered to her the consolations of religion, and a complete change came over her mind. Grieve not, then, for her. Happy on earth she never could have been again, but happy in heaven she doubtless now is."
Francisco and the young countess knelt by the side of the couch, and prayed for a long time in silence, with their faces buried in their hands. When they again raised their heads, and glanced around, the venerable old man no longer met their eyes. Christian Rosencrux had departed, leaving Francisco and Flora in complete ignorance of his name, but they experienced a secret conviction that he was something more than an ordinary mortal, and the remembrance of the blessing which he had bestowed upon them the preceding day shed a soothing and holy influence over their minds. Little now remains to be said. A few brief observations, and a rapid glance at the eventual fortunes and fates of the leading characters in the tale, will acquit us of our task. Nisida and Wagner were entombed in the same vault, and their names were inscribed upon the same mural tablet. The funeral was conducted with the utmost privacy, and the mourners were few, but their grief was sincere. And among them was Dr. Duras, who had loved Nisida as if she had been his own child. On the night following the one on which these obsequies took place, another funeral procession departed from the Riverola Palace to the adjacent church, and 2 coffins were on this occasion, as on the former, consigned to the family tomb. But the ceremony was conducted with even more privacy than the first, and one mourner alone was present. This was Francisco himself, and thus did he perform the sad duty of interring in sacred ground the remains of his ill fated mother Vitangela and her brother Eugenio. The manuscript of the late Count of Riverola was burnt. The closet which so long contained such fearful mysteries was walled up. The chamber where so many dreadful incidents had occurred was never used during the lifetime of Francisco and Flora. The grand vizier remained with his army a few days beneath the walls of Florence, and during that time Isaachar ben Solomon so far recovered his health and strength, under the careful skill of an Egyptian physician, as to be able to visit his dwelling in the suburb of Alla Croce, and secure the immense wealth which he had amassed during a long life of activity and financial prosperity. When the day of the grand vizier's departure arrived, he took a tender farewell of his sister Flora and his aunt, both of whom he loaded with the most costly presents, and in return he received from Francisco a gift of several horses of rare breed and immense value. Nor did this species of interchange of proofs of attachment end here, for every year until Ibrahim's death did that great minister and the Council of Riverola forward to each other letters and rich presents, thus maintaining to the end that friendship which had commenced in the island of Rhodes, and which was cemented by the marriage of Francisco and Flora. Isaachar ben Solomon and Manuel d'Orsini accompanied the grand vizier to Constantinople, and were treated by him with every mark of distinction. But the Jew never completely recovered from the tortures which he had endured in the prison of the Inquisition, and in less than 2 years from the date of his release, he died in the arms of the marquis, to whom he left the whole of his immense fortune. Manuel d'Orsini abjured Christianity, and entered the Ottoman service, in which his success was brilliant and his rise rapid, thanks to the favor of the grand vizier. The reader of Ottoman history will find the name of Mustapha Pasha frequently mentioned with honor in the reign of Solyman the Magnificent, and Mustapha Pasha, Beglerbeg of the mighty province of Anatolia, was once named Manuel d'Orsini. For nearly 16 years did Ibrahim Pasha govern the Ottoman realms in the name of the Sultan. For nearly 16 years did he hold the imperial seals which had been entrusted to him at a period when the colossal power of the empire seemed tottering to its fall. During that interval he raised the Ottoman name to the highest pinnacle of glory, extended the dominions of his master, and shook the proudest thrones in Christendom to their foundation. Ferdinand, King of Hungary, called him brother, and the Emperor Charles V of Germany styled him cousin, in the epistolary communications which passed between them. But a Greek who had long cherished a deadly hatred against the puissant grand vizier, at last contrived to enter the service of the sultan in the guise of a slave; and this man, succeeding in gaining that monarch's ear, whispered mysterious warnings against the ambition of Ibrahim. Solyman became alarmed, and opening his eyes to the real position of affairs, perceived that the vizier was indeed far more powerful than himself. This was enough to ensure the immediate destruction of a Turkish minister. Accordingly, one evening, Ibrahim was invited to dine with the sultan, and to sleep at the imperial palace. Never had Solyman appeared more attached to his favorite than on this occasion, and Ibrahim retired to a chamber prepared for him, with a heart elated by the caresses bestowed upon him by his imperial master. But in the dead of night he was awakened by the entrance of several persons into the room, and starting up with terror, the grand vizier beheld 4 black slaves, headed by a Greek, creep snake like toward his couch. And that Greek's countenance, sinister and menacing, was immediately recognized by the affrighted Ibrahim, though more than 15 years had elapsed since he had set eyes upon those features. Short and ineffectual was the struggle against the messengers of death. The accursed bowstring encircled the neck of the unhappy Ibrahim, and at the moment when the vindictive Greek drew tight the fatal noose, the last words which hissed in the ears of the grand vizier were,
"The wrongs of Calanthe are avenged."
Thus perished the most powerful minister that ever held the imperial seals of Ottoman dominion, and the long pent up but never subdued vindictive feelings of Demetrius were assuaged at last. Dame Francatelli had long been numbered with those who were gone to their eternal homes when the news of the death of Ibrahim Pasha reached Florence, but the Count and Countess of Riverola shed many tears at the sad and untimely fate of the grand vizier. Time, however, smooths down all grief, and happiness again reached to the Riverola palace; for when Francisco and Flora looked around them and beheld the smiling progeny which had blessed their union, when they experienced the sweet solace of each other's sympathy, the outpourings of 2 hearts which beat as one, ever in unison, and filled with a mutual love which time impaired not, then they remembered that it was useless and wrong to repine against the decrees of Providence, and, in this trusting faith in Heaven and in the enjoyment of each other's unwearying affection, they lived to a good old age, dying at length in the arms of their children. End of Part 2. End of Section 71. End of Wagner the Wehr-Wolf by George W. M. Reynolds.